the convention hall, but what's happening outside is certainly getting a lot of attention. When it comes to protesters, have you seen any? What's the vibe outside of the convention hall like? To what extent is it distracting from Democrats' message right now?
It's really supposed to start today. We've got 4 or 5 groups that are permitted and will be marching, but we're talking, Tim, about tens of thousands potentially of protesters, and there are groups that do not have permits. Police are trying to figure out the best way to deal with that, in some cases letting them proceed to avoid arresting thousands of people. But we did see a few folks out on the streets last night, some pretty big groups actually on Michigan Avenue, close to where we're staying here. It made it difficult to get in and out of the hotel and so forth, but nothing on the level that has been feared. You hear the comparisons to 1968. And concerns that there will be images of violence, billy clubs, mass arrests, this type of thing, pepper spray. Nothing like that has occurred yet. And I'll point you to breaking news on the terminal today now, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken says there is a new ceasefire deal that Benjamin Netanyahu has signed off on. We're waiting to hear from Hamas. If something like that were to emerge during this Democratic National Convention, it could mean a very different conversation and really blunt the message that a lot of these protesters have. The other thing I'll add, Tim, is that there are 30 delegates in the building who are uncommitted to Kamala Harris. They call themselves ceasefire delegates. And it's all about this one issue. They're pro-Palestinian delegates, and they too could change their tune if we see potentially a ceasefire deal put together this week. We're going to have to wait and see what happens.
What else are you expecting for the convention in terms of speakers that maybe you think will be a highlight this week?
Well, look, the highlight, of course, is the primetime address by Kamala Harris. But it's interesting to see how the Democratic Party is sprinkling in some of the big names from the past. Former President Bill Clinton is going to be speaking. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, you can see that Barack Obama is going to talk tomorrow night as they start to turn attention away from Joe Biden and toward Kamala Harris. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has just been added to the list for tonight, by the way, or at least that was just unveiled. We're going to hear from Hillary Clinton tonight as well, and the First Lady, Jill Biden. So not so much backward looking, but some names from the past in the Democratic Party as we gear up to the unveiling of the nominee later this week.
Hey, Joe, one name that we have not talked a lot about in the last 8 minutes has been former President Donald Trump, the Republican nominee. What is he going to do this week to try to suck out some of the air, at least of the media coverage and the attention from the DNC?
Yeah. They're going to be counter-programming over the course of the week, which is interesting because typically a party, I mean, at least in the old days of politics, kind of let the party have their week, let them get all the speechifying done, and then start hitting them hard on the weekend to blunt the argument here, knowing that the party typically gets a bounce in the polls coming out of the convention. But the Trump campaign has decided that with the momentum that the Harris camp is enjoying right now, they want to get the former president out on the road as well as Senator J.D. Vance. And they're actually going to be holding events throughout the course of the week. You're going to see Donald Trump likely taking questions from reporters so he can remind everybody that Kamala Harris has not. And that's likely something that will follow the convention. We'll see a round of interviews and a lot of travel. They'll go on a road trip to take the message to the people here. But it is true. Kamala Harris has not done a news conference or sat down for an interview with a journalist to answer hard questions since this all changed 4 weeks ago. And the question is when she will finally feel enough pressure to do that, Tim.
Joe, last question. She did see some positive news when it came to polling. New York Times Siena poll over the weekend, putting some states back in play because of gains that she has made there. What should we keep an eye on for in terms of polling and potential bump for the Harris campaign in the days following the convention?
Well, we are super focused on the swing states. That's why our Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll focuses exclusively on the 7 states that'll decide this election as opposed to a national poll. But you're right. The Washington Post Ipsos over the weekend here with a very important poll for Kamala Harris. She's beating Donald Trump in a head-to-head by 49 to 45%. There's another number in the poll, though, that's a lot more interesting to me, and that is independent voters. That's the real fight here. We know this is going to be a close election, and that slice in the middle of independents who could turn either D or R are really the voters that we're talking about here. And we saw quite a bit of improvement over Joe Biden here. Kamala Harris is now leading Donald Trump by 8 points among independents. Wow. Joe Biden was leading by only 2. So just in a couple of weeks' time, a very important shift in the numbers that we'll keep track on coming out of Chicago as well.
All right. Still more than 2 months to go, though, as we are constantly reminded. A big thank you to Joe Matthew, co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power, part of Bloomberg Television and Radio's special coverage on the ground in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. Bloomberg Radio will have live coverage of President Biden's keynote address at the Democratic National Committee Convention beginning at 10:30 p.m. Wall Street time tonight. So that's the word from Chicago, the word on the politics front. Now for more in the markets, and that is that greed has overcome fear on Wall Street. And the market cataclysm that shook up the world in recent weeks may well prove a mere blip on the long-term price charts. Denitsa Sokova is Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter. She's here in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Denitsa, 2 weeks ago, we would have been sitting in this studio talking about a potential emergency rate cut as a result of what was happening in the markets, that, softer than expected jobs number that came out the Friday before, 2 weeks ago Monday. My, how things have shifted. 8 days in a row higher on the S&P 500. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's really incredible reversal. As fast as fear was taking hold of markets, we saw need for tail risk protection. We saw obviously the VIX going so high. And now we're close to a record high. We just saw the biggest cross-asset rally this year. VIX is below 15. So everything that was worrying investors in the span of a couple of days disappeared even faster. And a lot of people are asking, what happened? Why is that? Obviously, technical forces have been a big aspect of this. We talk a lot about systematic selling. That has been definitely a big part. That's a growing universe of investors who are very sensitive to volatility, towards reversal trends, and they don't need fundamental reasons to sell. They need a trigger, and we saw some of those triggers activated. Of course, we're coming from a year where everyone was heavily concentrated in Magnificent Seven. Everyone was buying tech stocks. That was the only game in town. And you can imagine when something happens, everyone runs to the exits. And this is where we are.
So what are we seeing in terms of positioning now when you look at the data about where systemic funds are buying, what ETF flows look like? How are funds positioned for the rest of the year?
We actually saw a very sharp decrease in equity positioning from systematic investors. For example, volatility-controlled investors were so high in their equity exposure, they were at 110%, and they went back all the way to 50. So that said, those people are slowly seeing some buying. For sure, that amount of pressure that we saw in a matter of days, we can no longer see because they're a lot more well-balanced. So that type of tension is no longer there. We saw some de-risking from fundamental investors, but also a lot of people were buying the dip. Of course, Monday was a day where we saw a lot of volatility, reach for hedges, but rest of the days, investors weren't that risk averse, so we saw a lot of buying. So going forward, we may see potential support from those systematic forces that drove the indices down. And also positioning is still quite high, but it's not as stretched as it used to be. So in terms of technical forces, maybe they're more positive to what's going forward.
Okay, what about the fundamental macro forces that have caused traders and investors in recent weeks to take a step back and think, okay, wait a second, things might not be as bad as we thought they are?
Yes, for sure. We have seen those economic prints really rattling investors. When there is economic print, obviously, that's good for the soft landing. The market has been reacting very well. But we've seen any small print that's a little bit of disappointment also causing major drama in markets. So I think the biggest takeaway from what's going forward is positioning is still stretched. We just had this shock and investors are on edge. And obviously, fundamentally, we don't see a lot of people are talking about the VIX being so high, and many of the other occasions there was a global pandemic. There were a lot of really big fundamental reasons and fears, and this wasn't the case this time. But still, we're waiting for Jackson Hole. We're potentially about to see our first rate cut, and every little data point says a lot about what happens in the future meeting. Are we going to see 50 basis point? So yes, maybe we're no longer worried about rate cuts that's happening now, but we are still very vigilant about what the next steps are after September, maybe.
Just looking at equities. There was a lot of talk about a rotation trade in the last few weeks. We saw flows into small caps. People were talking about, buying the equal weighted S&P. What are your sources saying now? Because now I'm looking at the NASDAQ 100. It's still up 16% year to date. We still have NVIDIA earnings coming up. It still feels like there's a lot of positive sentiment towards the big tech AI plays that were working earlier in the year. And all this talk about a rotation, it's kind of dying down, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's been a big trend of maybe a lot of people were saying everyone will go from big tech to like other places. But what we have seen is that indeed, unloved places of the market are getting more love than they used to have. But also some of the deep buying we saw during the last few days of the rally, a lot of that money did go to big tech again. And we're seeing some of the big names seeing more gains.
it's mostly within Europe and in Canada. So you're actually going to see a very global portfolio of convenience store, which is actually a very hot space at the moment. There are a couple of other players across Europe, across the US, that could all be primed for takeover, especially if this deal were to happen.
Is the deal going to happen, though? I mean, some analysts are saying this actually might not end up, coming to fruition. This thing, the deal might not be signed.
So a lot of people who have followed this space for a while will remember that this is actually not the first attempt. There have been a couple of times where these two companies flirted with the idea of merging with each other. And not just that, like if you name all the possible combination, there are companies like EG Group, Parkland in Canada. I mean, every possible combination that could be explored had been explored at some point. And the biggest thing here is antitrust. Like I said, it's such a global operation. You're actually going to need regulatory approval in many regions. And given how much scrutiny you could face, especially in US and Europe, this could well be a very challenging deal. Even if it gets signed, it may not take shape as the way that they're proposing right now. A lot of these deals end up having very, very big divestiture plans where a third player would come in and like buy up some of the stores that are not approved because of antitrust reason. So this is a long process. Even if this deal gets signed, doesn't mean that ends there.
On the 7&I side, why has it been under pressure from activist fund Value Act Capital Management? And secondly, how do you think that activist investor is thinking about this proposal?
So we haven't heard from Value Act. Value Act actually ran a proxy campaign in Japan last year at 7&I, and it was unsuccessful in adding board members to 7&I. So Japan is a very unique market, as we know, and a lot of the retail investors, a lot of the stocks are retail investors, and then the retail investors usually tend to support the management. So in order to actually change in Japan, it's actually really difficult, and you have to be very culturally sensitive to do so. In this particular instance, Value Act wasn't able to make that change. But then the argument that they had that the company underperformed, that a company could see a higher stock price, that I guess exactly is what Kusha is seeing as well. With the yen being depreciated, that is a really good opportunity, a really good timing for Kusha to make a move, or for anyone else. So we should bear in mind that, again, there are so many players in this space. Everybody has looked at everyone else. So anything could happen. Maybe like another buyer could emerge, but we should expect Value Act to have some sort of comment at some point, given they still have a stake in the company.
Okay, Crystal, speaking of timing, what has been happening when it comes to timing in the deal space of late? I mean, it was just a week ago that we were talking about Mars agreeing to buy Kellanova. We have Boeing buying parts supplier Spirit Aerosystems. We have Bosch's acquisition of $8 billion in air conditioning assets. What's going on when it comes to where we are in the cycle and what you're seeing with deals?
Yeah, a lot of the deal makers have commented that this is an unusually busy summer. Since July, we've seen a flurry of deal making. And like I said, it's really unusual. First of all, for someone to be this busy, a lot of the deal makers themselves or company executives tend to take time off, and not this year. I guess partly it's to do with that the election in the back end of the year. It's really going to put a hurdle on a lot of deals. You don't really want to be caught in any sort of market cycle. So if you were to do a deal this year, you either get it done before September, before it gets too close to the election, or you wait till 2025. So this could be the last stretch of deals that we're seeing. And as you see, there are quite a few consumer retail transactions like Kellanova, like this one. It could also indicate that there are arguments to be made about the consumer strength. Potentially, it's that size and scale really does matter as a consumer retail company at this point more than anything else.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about what kind of macro signals we can learn from this uptick in deal activity. Does that mean that the consumer is weakening if these companies have to merge together?
Yeah, a lot of companies have actually passed on a lot of costs in the past couple of years to consumers just by raising prices. And that's where the growth has been coming from. And a lot of companies have felt that they have kind of maxed out on passing that cost to consumers. And for now, if you were to generate extra growth, you kind of have to be in the domain of deal making, in organic growth, by buying someone else, by getting bigger, and by going into regions and like geography that you're not already in. So that's another reason why some of these deals, mainly a lot of them are geographic. This one in particular is a geographic expansion. Kellanova, it's a portfolio expansion where Mars wanted to diversify into savory snacks versus just like sweet confectionaries. So again, it's a consumer play, but then also the really interesting thing, perhaps with Kellanova, and not so much here, is that the effect of Ozempic is on everyone's mind as well.
Interesting.
So if you see that everyone is expecting Ozempic in the consumer world, everyone is expecting Ozempic to have some sort of effect in the not so healthy category of food. And if you think about convenience store is also selling mostly confectionaries, potato chips. And if you expect in the long run Ozempic to have a bigger effect, you may as well have a bigger market share so that you can like withstand that weather a little bit better.
Hey, Crystal, before we let you go, just about 45 seconds left. Talk to us just a little bit about the idea of what your sources are telling you moving forward, given that we could see a rate cut in September, maybe 2 more rate cuts before the end of the year. Do we expect deal activity to increase when the Fed does lower rates?
Yeah, I think the interest rate has been a huge topic in the past 9 months. And then for now, I think most of the discussions has been whether we're getting too close to the election. Interest rate still remains a topic, but then it's not as important perhaps as something like an antitrust when you do a big transformative acquisition like this one.
All right. A big thank you to Crystal C., Bloomberg News deals reporter. She joins us from Switzerland. Check out her stories on the Bloomberg terminal and, of course, also at Bloomberg.com. We do see green across the screen when it comes to the major equity averages. The Dow Jones Industrial Average higher right now by close to 0.4%. The S&P 500 higher by 0.6%, while the NASDAQ higher by 0.9%. Coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week, we're going to check in with Jason Kelly. He's chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. He's got a preview of the cover of the next edition of Bloomberg Business Week magazine. It's about the gambling industry, and specifically this story, what NFL players really think about sports betting. First, though, a check on the latest world and national news. We got Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Tim. Kamala Harris is heading into the Democratic National Convention 4 points ahead of former President Donald Trump in the latest ABC News Washington Post Ipsos poll, but 9 points behind on the economy. Isaac Boltansky is Director of Policy Research at BTIG.
Donald Trump is still leading on the key issues that animate voters in the swing states, right? He still leads on the economy, inflation, and immigration. And those have generally been the 3 issues that tend to animate, excite, and define the voters' enthusiasm in the 6 to 7 states that will decide this election.
Isaac Boltansky with BTIG was a guest on Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Manus Cranny. Harris rolled out her economic policy agenda strategically. That's according to Brett Bruen, who served in the Obama White House and is now president of the Global Situation Room.
She wanted to put out not a complex theory, but some very concrete pieces that voters, especially voters in those battleground states, can relate to. They can relate to a child tax credit. They can relate to the price gouging issue.
Brett Bruen with Global Situation Room. Talk show host pioneer Phil Donahue has died. His nationally syndicated talk show was the first of its kind, where the host interacted with the studio audience. Phil Donahue was 88 years old. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris and this is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got stocks holding just about the best level of the day. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, very much in the green. Stocks are pushing higher, adding to a rally that is already topped $3 trillion from this month's lows, amid hopes that the Fed will signal it's ready to start cutting rates. S&P right now at 55.91, up 37, a gain of 0.7%. The Dow up 170, up 0.4, while NASDAQ is up 160, a gain there of 0.9%. 10-year 3.86% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.05%. Spot gold down 0.1%, 25.04 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.8%, 74.50 a barrel. And Bitcoin now at 59,156. Bitcoin down 1.1%. The source tells Bloomberg General Motors is cutting more than 1,000 software engineers as the automaker moves to lean up its software and services organization. More than 600 of those layoffs are said to be in Michigan. General Motors shares, they're up now by 1.1%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P up 39, up 0.7%. I'm